All right, welcome to our M plus DPS tier list here for 10.0 Dragonflight. I'm Dratnos, we've got Tettles and Dorki here as well, and we are going to talk about every single DPS spec in the game, all 22 of them now? 26?
1, 2, 3, 4.
There's a lot of them. We're going to talk about all of them, so we'll kind of zip through on some of them. Worth noting, there's a lot of caveats we got to get through here. Very early days here. There's probably going to be more balance changes than usual in the first couple weeks of this expansion, based on at least the indications and the fact that there's like this kind of mythic heroic launching at the same time thing. So there may be huge changes based on that. To this list, we also may have made mistakes. Although with Mythic Plus, we've been able to do quite a bit of testing. So this is fairly, I would say this is more likely to resemble the truth of it than the raid ones are probably.
I will also say that like you're gonna have to wait for things like tier sets to come out. This is obviously balanced with like tier sets in mind, but it's not going to change too much, I don't think, in just structurally how this tier list is going to
There's
work.
not like huge like AoE tier set bonuses like there were in Sepulchre, right? So it's not like a night and day difference. Like most specs are kind of gaining the same amounts as each other in AoE, right? Also, so we're aiming this list at what's going to be good for timing high keys, not necessarily like what's going to be the most possible DPS on a certain number of targets, what's going to be the best for like MDI, that kind of stuff. There may be some differences there. There are also some differences this season. We've kind of put a little bit more of a premium on survivability. Dorki, what's your thoughts on like how's the value of DPS survivability changed from Shadowlands?
Yeah, so normally before, like even in BFA, survivability was always a second, maybe even third or fourth. It was never that important. And it was really evident with Survival Hunters. I remember when we were discussing about Survival Hunter being possibly meta in the last 2 seasons, there was always a discussion of can that class even live?
Yeah.
From what I've seen so far, in beta at least, there is way more passive damage going out, rot damage, whatever you want to call it. And classes are just struggling to live, especially after the 40% change where healers aren't healing for as much as they used to. So I do think survivability weighs in way more than before.
All right, so we can start off here, but first, again, remember, it's a tier list. We're doing this for entertainment, information. A lot of it's going to be wrong. Don't invite or not invite people to your groups based off of this. If you're trying to decide which character to play as well, consider taking multiple sources of information and your own gameplay into account as well, rather than just blindly following this. That being said, what is our first spec that we've got up in the S tier?
Ooh, and you want to start with the S tier?
Oh, do you want to start down in D? We could do that too.
I was planning on just going
we could start in the middle as well.
I was planning on just going class by class. We can start with the S tier though.
Up to you. You're dealer's choice.
All right, I think we'll start in the S tier then. As a surprise to absolutely nobody, we had to kind of amend this tier list as it got created because there was one spec in the game that I would define as meta warping with just how strong they were.
Holy, what could this be?
Yeah, what could it possibly be? And so I need to add a row above this, and we got to name this one the Havoc tier. So Havoc Demon Hunter is probably the best overall damage spec in the game for M+ right now. And in addition to that, it has like some of the best survivability in the game. Just the way that they have passive healing. In addition to that, they take a lot less damage than other specs. Blur is an incredibly strong cooldown. Havoc Demon Hunter, I mean, what else like really doesn't it have? Like maybe some of their utility is a little bit lacking, but with the amount of damage it does, it is so silly compared to other specs.
Now, when you're putting this highly in your tier list, how much are you thinking that we're going to see like multiple Havocs in top groups? Or how much of this just like one Havoc guaranteed in all the top groups is what you're thinking here?
You know, I've heard rumors that we might see triple Demon Hunter.
All right, lit. Because when I see like a tier above S, I'm thinking of BFA season 2 when triple Outlaw or double Outlaw was like the meta and everything else was So if that reaches this tier, yeah.
Okay, I don't think it goes that far. I feel like Rogues in particular in that season was just way too good. Because it wasn't just good at damage, it brought everything, right? Like it was unkillable, you had a lot of shrouds, a lot of CC, a lot of control. It was just good at everything. Good at single target, good at AoE. I don't think Havoc is necessarily that at the moment.
All right, so it's somewhere between S and BFA Season 2 Outlaw. Okay.
Yes. It's
somewhere in that gulf.
It is ridiculously good. And the fact that it has no real tangible downsides is something that, like, that is a reason that you would put this above some of these other specs that we have in S tier, which are, by the way, ridiculous.
Well, if I were to say one downside of Havoc right now is it doesn't really survive when it comes to having to survive a bunch of one-shots because they don't really take Neverwalk anymore. Now all they have is meta immune, if you can even count that, and blur. And I guess like darkness, if you get lucky with darkness.
Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable.
Yeah, but that's like the one slight weakness I've noticed. Like I remember doing some of these overtuned bosses before, Overgrown Ancient, with a burst forth, trying to survive that on like a high tyrannical. Demon Hunters always die to that unless they, for some reason, went for Neverwalk, which never happens, by the way.
Yeah, it's just Netherwalk's just in a weird spot, but they're not able to really take it pretty reasonably without losing damage.
All right, then we have the S tier. We've got 2 rogue specs headlining our S tier here. We have Subtlety and Outlaw. Now, when are the places where you're expecting to see Subtlety versus Outlaw? Is this dungeon specific, you think the difference would be, or is it based on the rest of your group?
This is a weird situation. So first off, I think Outlaw is just going to be the preferred spec for most, if not all dungeons, just due primarily to the amount of damage it brings. Obviously, both of these specs have similar utility in the things that they provide. Outlaw is target capped with Blade Flurry, and so maybe in Algathar Academy you would see a sub-rogue over that, but generally it seems like the damage that Outlaw is providing, in addition to just like the rogue utility, which both of these specs share, I would expect to kind of see that spec over the other one. But the reason that Sub is also an S tier is because Sub does a lot of things really well, including like they have really strong burst damage that Outlaw doesn't have. But I mean, generally their overall damage is also competitive with other S tier options. And while you would play Outlaw in most situations, it felt like it would be a disservice to put Sub anything below S.
I think one strength of Outlaw too is it's able to do Prio while continuing to do AoE. Well, I guess you can call it Cleave. Which is not necessarily the same for Sub-Rogue. Sub-Rogue, you sort of choose one or the other one. You either Black Powder or you eviscerate the Prio target. One thing I've also noticed with Sub is it's a pretty CD-oriented spec. I was talking with Yoda about this a little bit, and he said it seems like one of those specs that shine really hard in lower keys.
Okay.
You just go into a pack, you blast through cooldowns, everything dies, and if the things don't die fast enough, where like if mobs are living, your damage starts to fall off a little bit. So it's like the opposite of Outlaw, where Outlaw you just have damage the entire time. That's something to consider.
I will say that previously, I think that like some of the reasons that you've seen Rogue so highly is because of their utility with things like Shroud of Concealment and like infinite stops with like Gouge and Blind and stuff like that. While those things are good, one of the major reasons that Outlaw, like the 2 Rogue specs are this high is their defensiveness. Just like Feint and then multiple immunities to different sources of damage is universally fairly strong.
Oh yeah, they're unkillable.
Yeah.
All right, now another spec that's actually also pretty unkillable, but requires you to press your buttons rather than have your cheat death proc to not die is Windwalker. That's our next S tier spec. This one, throughout beta, it's kind of been, they've nerfed this spec a couple times in beta, but it still seems pretty phenomenal in keys, right?
Oh yeah, it's very good. I think it's a little bit lacking on single target compared to the other OP specs, but it does have insane AoE execute with the Todd thing. Like just being able to spam Todd is actually pretty insane. Sometimes you'll see mobs vanish and you won't even realize what it was until you realize there's a Windwalker in your team, and he just like shoots up 200k DPS.
Just speaking,
but, yeah.
I was gonna say, just speaking about like the defensiveness and the utility aspects of it, they have 4 defensive buttons in Touch of Karma, Fortifying Brood, Dampen Harm, and Diffuse Magic. Most specs would be pretty happy with like 2 of these. Windwalker, like you alluded to, kind of unkillable, has basic tank level defensiveness if you're rotating through defensives for every single mechanic that you may face. For their utility, obviously like Leg Sweep and Ring of Peace have always been basically top tier M+ utility, and so you're not really upset to have this.
One thing that also is it has that, I think it's called like Grace to Heart, and this one
Generous
thing that gives
Pour.
you Generous Pour, yeah. Those 2 are insane. Well, Generous Pour doesn't really work right now, but
yeah, it's
assuming
bugged.
it worked.
Yeah, so this is
a
a 10 yards around you avoidance increase and a 10 yard around you healing taken increase?
Yeah, up to 8% healing increase. Those are both like absurdly good, especially for high keys.
Yeah, monks and that's on the monk class tree, so it's a strength of any monk, but especially Windwalker because you'll be in that melee stack. And with the other specs we're seeing here, it looks like we're predicting a 2 or 3 melee meta in many keys. That being said, we do have one range DPS spec that has ascended to the S tier, and that is the Demonologician. Demonology lock. What are how is this different than the Shadowlands demo lock, and why is it all the way up here in S?
I think that one of the biggest reasons that it's in S tier, so first off, its damage, like its AoE damage is not anything crazy, but its single target damage is still fairly strong comparing it to other classes. The biggest thing that, and one of the biggest reasons that Demonology is in S tier, kind of consistent with the other S tier specs and Havoc, is that they're also unkillable. And I mean, it's something that they don't need healing, and so your healer's able to do more damage whenever you have things like Soul Leech, Unending Resolve, Demon Skin, and Dark Pact. Like, those 4 ways to be able to just like survive any incoming damage is always going to put you in a really good spot. I don't think they're like top 5 DPS for AoE, but they're probably somewhere in the top 10 for overall damage in dungeons. And then on top of that, with you not playing that many ranged generally, this could also fill a slot where it's just easier to manage thundering, it's easier to manage like some of the melee mechanics, and you have decent boss damage from the demo lock.
Yep, very good. This is the one spec that you don't notice you taking any damage. Also, health stones are very good. Very, very good.
And soulstone occasionally.
One more thing too is amplified curses. I don't think people value that enough. Amplified curse is actually insane. It makes caster mobs cast extremely slow.
Dude.
So, and I mean, there are so many caster mobs this expansion.
We didn't talk about it too much, but numbing poison from both of the rogue specs is also very silly.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
All right. Let's pop down to the A tier. Up first here, we have the Enhancement Shaman, which I haven't seen too much of this on beta keys that I've been watching, but I've heard that might be because it requires a 150 IQ to pilot the spec in keys. But in theory, do we like it for the damage? Tettles, what's the rationale behind Enhancement?
It's mostly that it's like priority damage and single target damage is like incredibly high. Like even after the 20. Okay, so first off, you got aura nerf by 25%, and then they kind of cut back on that a little bit. And they're like, all right, 25% was too much. Enhancement prior to the 25% aura nerf was already really doing competitive amounts of AoE damage and like overall damage, but its priority is really where it excelled. I kind of went back and forth a lot as to whether or not I should put this in S tier, but I ultimately I think we ended up landing on A due to the fact that like it was largely survivability based. Enhancement survivability is fairly strong, but it's not at the same level as some of those specs that are above it.
Yeah, so Enhance I haven't really seen too much, so I can't really speak too much about it. I've only seen a couple and it seemed alright, but I am pretty convinced that it's probably still extremely strong.
It has a lot of really good utility as well, from like AG, being able to keep your group healthy. They also have the shortest interrupt with Wind Shear. Cap Totem is like an I don't think it's like a good stun, but it's like an okay stun. And then the Thundershock knockup is from the Thunderstorm is so sick in some situations.
Yeah. Can they also play that Stone Skin totem thing? I haven't really seen them playing it.
I don't know if they're able to get into that totem.
Yeah, I'm curious about that because that is kind of nice utility.
Yeah, that one's it's right at the bottom of the class tree. So it would be you'd be dropping like AG potentially to go and get it.
But I don't know if you can drop AG to get it.
Actually, it's right below Thundershock. If you're taking Thundershock, it's only 1 more point. So
okay. Yeah, maybe it's worth.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure what their builds currently look like. Either way, next one on our list here is the Frost Mage. Now, this is our first mage spec that we've got here, and we're predicting that it's going to be Frost is the go-to mage in the high keys. What are the strengths and weaknesses of this one versus, say, the other mage specs? And do we think that, I mean, often mage does make its way into the high keys. Is that something we're expecting to see maybe in the very highest keys, or not as much this season?
Dude, speaking of mage versus mage specs, you want to know what's messed up about Frost Mage right now?
Oh, do tell.
It took Fire Breath, or Flame, what do you call it? DB? It took DB, and it took Flame Wave, or the hell, from Fire Mages. Like, how is that allowed? You have a class that already gives infinite slows, and it now took all of the utility that Fire Mage brought.
Yeah.
So I felt like that part is insane. The
So
fact that it has perma slow and anvils at the same time.
I think that mage is actually in a really good position to be fairly strong in the metagame for like going out like through Dragonflight. Right now, all 3 of the mage specs, I think their overall damage, and I mean, it's going to be kind of consistent talking with them, is a little bit lackluster. Frost Mage's like overall damage, if you're just looking at it in isolation, not great. It's like okay, but they do a lot of priority damage is one of the big things. And then on top of that, like Dorki was alluding to, they have a passive 60% slow, and then they also have Ice Block, a greater invisibility, alter time, mirror image. It's like, okay, that's some, and then Frozen Barrier, which is like some of those abilities are on the GCD, which is kind of annoying, but at the same point, it's a lot of tools and a lot of defensiveness. I mean, that's one of the reasons that they're an A. If their damage gets buffed at all, like any of the mage specs, I think that it's like, okay, these are going to be really, really good for like long periods of time.
It's also one of the only Lust classes that are sort of worth bringing at the moment. There's not a whole lot of specs that you want to bring for Lust at the moment.
We don't have any Lust in S or Havoc tiers, so these are our first ones here on the DPS side. It is worth noting that Preservation Evokers do bring Lust, so you may not need it from your DPS.
I will say that like a lot of the DPS compositions I think are going to be based around like whether or not you're playing with like a Preservation Evoker or a Resto Druid, because I think that those are the two healers that are like pretty hot in contention. I think that you're going to want to ideally pick up a Lust from somewhere in the DPS if you are playing with like a non-Lust healer.
Yeah, it'll definitely depend heavily on if you're bringing a Resto Druid or Evoker.
All right, up next we have the Retribution Paladin, which what's our thoughts here behind putting Ret all the way up in A? I've heard a lot of Ret complaining throughout beta. Are we thinking that it's it's the cleave that makes it good in M+ still?
I mean, the big reason that it's like not great in Raid, but it's decent in M+ is because they're actually able to press Consecration, I think is the big thing. And like a lot of their AoE is focused around Consecration. Their damage is good. It's not like absolutely tip-top tier, but it is like really solid damage, and they're able to do a decent amount of overall. But there are some pretty glaring weaknesses, right, Dorki, to Ret?
Yeah, I would say the biggest one by far is survivability. This class seems to die a lot. It's only really got either Divine Protection or Shield of, what do you call it? Shield of Vengeance, whatever.
Yeah.
It's either those two, and you have Bubble. That's about it. Like, you have Word of Glory healing, yeah, but it's not that amazing, and you lose a lot of DPS for having to spam that. Yeah,
like spamming all your Holy Power and Word of Glory is just like not something you realistically want to do, because you end up losing a lot of damage. Ultimately, they're an A tier because their damage is pretty good, but
yeah, I mean, this is definitely the best Red has been in terms of performance. Like, I'm not gonna say the same about playstyle or whatever, but in terms of like strictly performance, this class is definitely performing. It's probably like even the highest amongst these A tier specs. Although I would say their single target is a little bit lackluster. They're definitely more of a AoE specialist at the moment.
I agree with that.
Yeah,
they're actually just melee hunter survivability though.
All right, up next we have the Feral Druid. This has got to be the highest Feral Druid has been tiered in an M+ tier list since Mythic Plus has been added to the game, right? What has changed for Feral that brings it up this high?
The biggest thing by far is it actually does damage now. Like, not only can it do damage over time, but also just does like way more upfront damage. Like, you can actually just burst so much harder by putting up all your dots instantly, and Ferocious Bite is AoE now, all that stuff. Yeah, this class does a lot of damage. It also brings what do you call it? Nature's Vigil. Nature's Vigil is insane. I've seen Feral Druids out healing Yumi TV many times over. The only problem with Feral Druid at the moment is their survivability is also a little bit lacking. They're very similar to Red Paladins in a lot of ways. You've got Bark Skin, you've got Survival Instincts, but that's really about it. You can bear form, yeah.
You have Pred Swiftness healing too, but like realistically, it's weird whenever you have Barkskin and SI and that's still not enough. Like, I think that is going to show how ridiculous this season is damage intake wise if SI and Bark aren't enough.
Yeah.
Mark of the Wild,
a very good spec though.
Mark of the Wild is also sick. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so another, like, if the Preservation Evoker is there instead of the Resto Druid, then the Feral Druid starts to get pretty compelling.
I think that Feral is like, if you're looking at overall DPS, Feral is going to be in the top 5 for overall damage, but they definitely have some survivability weaknesses. Additionally, I think their single target damage is not the greatest, especially compared to some of these other specs that just do full single target while being talented into AoE talents. So
maybe a Fortified Weak monster.
I think just all around pretty good. It's just some situations it's like pretty lacking. If they can die, they can die, I think is one of the biggest things.
One thing I would say is that I could definitely see Feral Druid being played in like quote unquote meta comp if you don't have a Druid. Like just having Mark of the Wild being brought is very big.
You can also B-res healers.
That is true.
All right, now a spec that doesn't have B-res is Fury Warrior, but that is still going to make it into our A tier. Does have Battle does have Rally as well. Quite a bit of value this time around. Fury has historically been pretty great in rot damage situations too, because they can do quite a bit of self-healing and sustain through those sorts of things. Although against a lot of heavy incoming one-shot style damage, things get a little dicier, right?
Yeah, so like Cold Steel, Hot Blood, Impending Victory, and Rage Regen, then like Rallying Cry, D-Stance, and Spell Reflect are all things that Fury Warrior regularly has. And like, all right, once you start listing off that many defensive abilities on top of the fact that their AoE damage is fairly solid and it's like pretty bursty, I mean, it looks pretty good for Fury. I think that it's reasonable to put them in A tier. Are they like a universal pick? No. Are they a DPS that could slot into a third slot and have pretty solid success? Yeah, I think that's like a reasonable expectation for them.
Agreed. They're also just much tankier than before. I mean, the big thing is, being able to just ignore pain and shield block and all the passive healing they have, the amount of leech they have. It's pretty crazy.
All right, now we're putting Shadow Priest up here in the A tier. I've played Shadow Priest in a lot of high tiers in my life and in these tier lists before a patch, and it's never worked out so far. This time for sure, though. What is making us think Shadow is going to be a good pick?
You want to talk about this, Dorki?
So here's how I see Shadow Priest. I've played with many Shadow Priests in my beta life. I've also seen a lot of Shadow Priests, and God, I hate playing with Shadow Priest, man. It is miserable. Not only do they want to constantly chain mobs, and they're also wanting to pull around their cooldown, their void form, whatever the hell, but also they have a 45-second long kick, and that is very problematic in these Dragonflight dungeons that require a lot of interrupts.
Yeah.
They're also not that tanky, but they do really good damage. Like I've seen them pop off in many situations. They're solid damage all around, and the utility is really good. They can actually PI other people now, which is unheard of before. They could also heal for an insane amount with Vampiric Embrace.
I think that a lot of their tankiness is okay. So against one shots, they're not very tanky, but against any amount of rot damage, I think that they're likely unkillable. Just due to the amount of self healing that they will do. I think that the big thing for Shadow is like it's good at all of the things that aren't exactly doing damage in the dungeon. I think their utility is fairly strong. They bring Fortitude. Like it's surprising to talk about Shadow Priest survivability being good, but like having a spammable purge is not bad. Like all that kind of stuff. MD is pretty good on some dungeons as well. So you just kind of have to weigh it out. I think it's like pretty consistent with some of the other A tier specs.
Oh wait, do they also have shorter MD? Because the other pre-specs, they can have shorter MD, right?
They can talent it. I don't know if they can get to it, like knowing where it is in the tree. Considering
it's
where it is
fairly low on the, or fairly high up in the tree. I think it doesn't look that unrealistic. I don't know how much it makes into the builds though.
I mean, it's pretty big. It's very noticeable in a lot of situations.
Mm-hmm.
Like
I think
bursting in particular.
Yeah, I guess the problem is they have a lot of damage on their tree, on their class tree that they probably have to take.
Oh, you're saying like how much they have to lose taking it?
Yeah.
I think they can get to it though. I think that they can get to it looking at it.
Okay, yeah.
I see.
I'm not a
but
shadow
I do
scientist.
feel like the PI is definitely very big. Because I mean, you've seen people taking PI before, even when it wasn't necessarily the best thing ever.
Mm-hmm.
But now they just like give it for free. It does feel like one of those specs that you'll probably see more from like organized high level groups if they do want to field a Shadow Priest. But for the most part, I don't really see Shadow Priest being that popular in pug runs. Or just like,
because of the need to keep chain pulling.
Just everything about it. Like the 45-second kick can be very problematic if people don't have the kicks down, and PI might not necessarily be that useful if you're not playing with like a set group.
I really don't know how many of these A tier specs are going to be super popular just due to like historical.
Yeah.
If you look at A tier, what we have right now, and you told me to guess what tier this was, and you asked me this.
Yeah,
like 6
this
months
is like
ago.
D tier from last season. Yeah,
I'm guessing C. I think every single time. So I think that like just historically these specs aren't particularly strong. And so I don't think you're going to see them a lot, but I do think that they bring some very strong elements to their kit, which like warrant them to be, I mean, at least considered for a third DPS slot in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, they're just like really solid. Like if you want to play these, you won't feel bad at all.
Mm-hmm.
You actually do good damage now.
All right, our final A tier spec is Unholy Death Knight. Dorki, this spec has been one of your one of the ones that you've played on and off, I guess, at different times. Yeah, what's the deal with Unholy in Dragonflight?
So Unholy DK, this class does insane uncapped AoE damage, as it has done historically. This reminds me a lot of BFA when I played Unholy DK a bunch. It's extremely good. It will do a lot of overall damage in specific dungeons. It's also very much unkillable, probably more unkillable than before. Especially because, like, you have short AMS now. AMS is also stronger. You've got Permafrost. You've got Lichborn DR. You've got IBF. So you've got a ton of stuff as Unholy DK. The only problem with Unholy DK is it's a very niche pick.
Mm-hmm.
It like, if you're just pulling 3 mobs at a time, if you're just pugging keys, people aren't pulling around your CDs, this class might not perform as well. I mean, it's still going to perform really well. It's just not going to be anywhere near S tier or, even beyond that.
But Dorki, I saw somebody do 130k DPS overall in Algathar Academy.
That is true. That is the Algathar specialist. Like if there's any spec that might see some MDI play, I think that's Unholy DK.
Mm-hmm.
I can just see you like go into an MDI pull, you're just gonna pop off 20 stacks of Fester Might and just do like crazy pile damage with bursting swords. It's gonna be a good time. But I don't see it being popular in high keys. I mean, it's the exact same as BFA. Even BFA, this was not popular at all, even though I was popping off of it.
It's good if your tank is like really catering to you, but the fact that it needs so much assistance to be like average is not like really great for it.
Yeah, and also a lot of these dungeons you can't pull big even if you wanted to, because like you're not really gated by the tanks of survival. You're gated by the amount of kicks and the amount of dangerous mechanics. Yeah, you're just not going to be pulling big in Dragonflight.
All right, moving on down to the B tier, which I think there's actually quite a few specs in B tier that I expect to be maybe even easier to leverage in like pug keys than we have for our A tier, some of our A tier specs. So again, note that this may not line up with what you see being good in the weekly 15s. That being said, our first B tier spec, actually, I do think is still going to be worse than the other rogue specs. It's assassination for in 15s and in high keys. I think this one is going to be a noticeable chunk behind subtlety and outlaw, right?
It seemed like it was just like I played with it a decent amount over the past couple of days, especially after it got buffed most recently, and it seemed like it was just like a decent amount of damage behind both sub and outlaw. Now, it does have some things going for it positively. First off, it's a rogue. It can't die. It has all the rogue utility. On top of the rogue utility, it also has the ability to be able to Garrote silence 8 mobs, which is really, really good in some dungeons for some periods of time. But they also require catering around. You have to re-stealth. You're not allowed to chain pull too much. It's like, I don't know. This is super annoying. And then on top of that, they have 2 other specs that are like really high on the tier list. It's difficult to put a third rogue spec any higher than B, I think.
So one thing I don't really know about Sin is, does this spec require building into single target or AoE? Because traditionally it's always been one of those specs where you're either good at doing AoE or good at doing single target.
So as it currently stands, their single target is still fairly solid. I think it's going to be a spec that you actually see a decent amount in rating due to the amount of single target damage that they currently are outputting. But their AoE damage is where they start to definitely fall behind a little bit.
I see. I don't know too much about Sin Rogues.
You do play a different build than your like raid build. You play the indiscriminate carnage that lets you 8 target your Garrote and Rupture, which is on the opposite side of the tree. So the M plus build is pretty different than the raid build, but it's not actually that much less single target on M plus bosses.
It's just not that much more AoE.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice. It's I mean, again, you've got Iron Wire, which is a silence for 6 seconds, and then it's also a 15% reduced damage for 8 seconds on the mobs that you've garroted, and you're hitting 8 mobs with that. Like that does own at the start of a lot of pulls.
You could oppressive roar the Garrote silence.
Oh my god. The wombo combo.
That'd be epic.
Next spec on our list here is the Arcane Mage. Arcane has gotten a buff a few weeks ago, and since then it's actually been sort of popping off on the damage meters in keys.
So it's a bit contentious as to whether or not Frost or Arcane is going to be the preferred mage spec for M+. I think that we ended up leaning towards like Frost being slightly better just due to the slows. Arcane, it may do a little bit more damage in some situations, but like a big downside of it is like the way it does damage being super cooldown reliant, forced to hardcast so many abilities. They do have some ways of like moving while casting missiles and stuff like that now, so it's a little bit less turrety. But there are a lot of dungeons with swirlies that force Arcane to move a lot. In addition to that, like you kind of have to play around them, which you don't really want to be playing around something that's like in the middle of the pack. You would rather be like having them be like a plug and play kind of spec. I think that overall, though, the biggest downside of Arcane is that you can play Frost and then do about the same level of dungeons and have a just slightly more utility from Frost.
I do feel like Arcane may be a little bit underrated. I have heard from a little birdie that it might be kind of insane. I don't know for sure. I have seen it burst for like an insane amount, like actually an absurd amount, but I don't know how gimmicky it is or if it's like really viable in high keys.
Yeah, I mean,
so I can't really say for sure.
From my position as well, it's like it could be slightly better than Frost. I don't see it going anything higher than A. It looks like it's going to be good in raid in particular, but like realistically, if I'm doing something, I would just kind of like swap Frost and Arcane from A and B. I just don't see it going any higher than A realistically, unless it is just that much better damage wise than it seems.
All right, we are placing the newest class in the game here in the B tier with Devastation Evoker. This one, I actually feel like the way the Devastation works, it's going to be a really nice pug key spec. But as we start getting into higher keys, what makes us think that it's going to start to maybe fall off a little bit compared to the specs we've tiered above it?
I do think that you could have like made an argument to put this in A. I think that this is like a really close cutoff spec for whether or not it's in A or B. Realistically, the upside of Devastation Evoker is like, for one, it brings a Bloodlust, which I mean we talked about. Like you can play as Preservation Evoker, but if you're not playing that, you're likely going to want to find lust elsewhere. And their damage is fairly solid. Their overall damage, especially like you mentioned in lower keys, is pretty good. It's not the absolute top tier or anything, but it's not something that you're like you feel bad playing whenever you look at the damage meter after the run. I think the big downside though is like their survivability. The Obsidian Scales is like decent, especially since now that you have 2 charges of it. But realistically, outside of that, and then like some living flame healing, you don't really have too much else. Like you do have like Zephyr, like a bleed dispel, like all of those things are really good. But it's not going to help the Devastation Evoker live burst forth cast on Overgrown Ancient or stuff like that, right?
Yeah, they do. They have Renewing Blaze as well if they want, right? The thing that's like, as long as you don't actually get one shot, you heal back up all the damage over 8 seconds, which is pretty cool. But
it has some things going for it, but it doesn't seem like it's like super sick at like anything in particular. I do think it's not bad though. Maybe Dorki has a different experience though with it.
When I'm looking at A tier, I do feel like maybe it could belong in the A tier. I mean, it does do extremely competitive damage, and it does bring the lust, since it's like, you know, the only other luster in this whole list. I guess aside from Enhancement Shaman.
Yeah, we have Enhancement Frost. Yeah,
that's like all we really see up here. So I do feel like there is some value in that. I can't really say for sure too though. Like I haven't seen too much. I've seen Maestein doing really well on it, but that's about it.
It also has like some nice displacement effects. It has like Wing Buffet and the Tail Swipe, whatever, the knockup. So I mean, it does
AoE stops.
It brings some nice stuff. It's more of a situation of like the dungeons do so much damage. I just don't know how they're going to be able to live once you start to get to higher levels, and then they don't do absolute top tier damage. Their damage is not bad though.
Agreed.
All right, another spec that we're a little bit concerned about in terms of survivability in the high keys. We've got Beast Mastery Hunter, which Hunter, whenever we tier Hunter, we always talk about it being a fragile class. It's kind of gotten worse this expansion as well, because you've lost Marksman's Advantage, which was like a 10% DR against bosses last expansion. And they kind of haven't gained all that much in their tree, especially when you think about how much other classes have gained defensively. So that's my biggest fear about Hunters. How do you guys feel about BM?
If there's one thing, so here's what I said last night to my stream about Hunters. I said, Hunter is the worst class in the game.
I agree.
Like, as a whole. It's actually ridiculous. Their only useful utility before, Binding Shot, is worthless now, which is actually like really sad. They also just die. Like the class is extremely squishy and doesn't have any way of sustaining.
I tend to agree that it's the worst class in the game. It's like so the upsides of BM and why it's in B is like their damage is fairly solid. They do like okay AoE, and they do pretty okay single target. It's not like any of their damage is really of concern to the point where you're looking to rank them anything lower. But like there is a major issue with their defensive. So first off, they have Fortitude of the Bear, Survival of the Fittest, Aspect of the Turtle, and Exil. Those are all their defensives, and they're all, I would describe them as bad defensives on long cooldowns. And if you have four bad defensives on long cooldowns and no real way to self-sustain, it's a recipe for disaster. In dungeons that you kind of die in 15, Beast Mastery Hunter needs a lot more healer attention to make sure they don't just get like pushed over.
Yeah, that being said, it is a nice spec in terms of like playing it in the keys. It's easy to dodge swirlies, still do your full damage. You got the benefits basically of being a melee and a ranged, right? Like any situation that favors either melee or ranged, Beastmaster are kind of sitting there with a grin like, yeah, I'm fine with this, which it can be good. And it is, it does have some nice utility. The Binding Shot nerf is definitely tragic for what was a unique piece of Hunter utility and is now just a much worse AoE stun than every other AoE stun in the game.
I hope that they get they need like one more really good defensive button, in my opinion.
All right, up next we have the Elemental Shaman, which throughout beta cycle, this one has had, I would say, it's got one of the most promising talent trees. It has a lot of different cool builds you can go with it, like lava build, lightning build. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do there. Why do we have Elemental here in B?
So I've heard some really high copiums that LE Shaman belongs higher. Well, I don't know, man. I've played with Zaro playing LE a bunch, and it seemed okay at best. Like, it does good damage. AG is insanely good.
Yeah.
Another less class as well.
A lot. They die a lot for sure. Like, one thing I've noticed is we've been playing with a lot of OP classes, right? And we're just doing these keys. We have Zaro in there. We also have a Havoc and a Demonology. And anytime there's any group damage happening, you already know who's the first one who's going to die. It's been Zyro time and time again.
So like,
now, are we sure it's not just Zyro being bad, or
It could very well be the case, but his argument is one heal. I just needed one heal.
compelling counter argument?
I think Ellie and Devastation are kind of in a similar spot where they actually have a decent amount of upside to the point where you could argue that they're in A. I mean, Ellie's damage in particular is not really that bad, but the issue with Ellie, at least from my perspective, is like it's a jack of all trades, like master of none type, which you don't really hope to see. Like, it doesn't have like super top tier defensiveness, it doesn't have super top tier AoE, it doesn't have super top tier single target damage. Now that's normally like pretty good for raid. Like, you kind of hope for those things for raid because then it allows you to be brought for multiple fights and that kind of thing. And they're like, survivability is not bad with Nature's Guardian, Astral Shift, and like Earth LEDR, but realistically, yeah, whenever you're comparing it to, we talked about Feral Druid survivability not being great, and they have SI Barkskin and then self-healing and like Vigil and stuff like that. So it's like, okay, whenever you put it in perspective like that, and we talked about Feral survivability not being great, Ellie's also going to have a similarly difficult time, and if they're doing slightly worse damage, it's unfortunate that they're in B tier, but I do think that like them and Devastation Evoker do have the upside of like, they could potentially, I could see them being an A by the end of this cycle if people start playing them and seeing success with it.
Yeah, like I do feel like Ellie could be undervalued, but I feel that way about a lot of these B tier specs. It's just so hard to really gauge these B and A tier specs since they all sort of suffer from similar issues. None of them are particular S tier, but I do feel like A and B sort of blends really well together at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd be easy to throw them all together in one tier and not separate them, but that's coward activity that we don't do here. We're putting our money where our mouth is.
Wait until they see the raid ones.
Okay, the raid one we're a little bit it's more ambiguous. I think reasonably so. Anyways,
yeah, we're just hard separating them.
Yeah. Okay, we got Affliction Warlock up next here in B. Now, towards the end of Shadowlands, this spec was doing twice as much DPS as any other spec in the Faded raids. So how is this only in B in our M+ tier list?
So it's like a ranged Unholy Death Knight. So Unholy Death Knight was really good whenever you were setting up for it. It was incredibly good in these MDI style pulls where you're doing like massive AoE. It was particularly like an Algathar Academy specialist. Affliction Warlock is very similar. Their AoE damage, especially on high target counts, is incredibly high. Actually, some of the highest DPS in the game, to the point where you could actually see sometimes Affliction Warlocks kind of competing with some of these other top tier specs in Algathar Academy. The downside is that they do like 35k single target DPS, which is it's like notoriously bad at single target damage. And while they're good at 1 out of 8 dungeons, there are 8 dungeons in the pool, and so it's like, okay, it's good in one dungeon, it's not as good in the other ones. But I don't like, and it requires very specific setup and preparation to excel.
Yeah, it seems really bad in a lot of dungeons I've seen, but it is still Warlock spec, so I feel like that gives it enough to be put in the B. So I think B is very good for Afflock.
I think it's pretty reasonable. Like, their defensiveness is stupid. They're a Warlock, yeah.
All right, rounding out our B tier, we have the Frost Death Knight, which I think for like people pugging keys, DK, it's going to be really annoying because you either are playing Unholy or Frost, and both kind of have similar, like, if you're in a pug situation, people are not pulling big enough for your Unholy DK. They're pulling slowly enough that your Breath of Syndragosa is falling off. You're playing Frost. I guess maybe you could play Obliteration keys. I don't know how that works, Dorki. What's your stance on Frost in key?
I'm not gonna lie, I have no idea what Frost is like. I haven't played it yet, or I haven't seen anyone play it. But one thing I could say about it is, if Breath is the best build, Breath will never be good in M+. It's just the way Breath is designed.
So here's the deal with Frost DK. It's one of the top DPS on like 2 to 4 targets right now with their breath build, but Breath, like Dorki alluded to, is very difficult to get good effectiveness out of, and their Obliteration build seems like it's like not as strong damage wise as you would hope. Their defensiveness is really good, but like it's going to be difficult for you to play this at a top tier level, even if their damage is so high on like these lower target counts.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot of confidence in Frost, but I don't actually know anything about Frost at all.
All right, yeah, I played some Frost in season 4 of Shadowlands, and definitely the experience of playing a Breath of Syndragosa build and then having your breath fall off 10 seconds in because the pull is over was heart shattering. So
I mean,
yeah.
Here's the deal, like Frost DK with the Breath build looks like it's going to be pretty solid in raid because a lot of the raid fights have cleave, right? So they're able to get good value out of the Breath of Syndragosa because they're able to hit a target permanently. It's not always the case for M+, so it's like difficult
Well, it's not just that. In raid specifically, raid is a very scripted fight. You know exactly when you want to be pressing your breath. Like, it's like, oh, at this moment I should press my breath. At this moment I should wait for the mechanic to happen, then I press my breath. You know, like it's very scripted. Whereas in M plus, things happen. Either your tank randomly, you know, pulls too much mobs and dies, or you have to randomly B-res your healer because Yumi TV is dead, or you know,
That would never
maybe
happen.
the pack just dies in 5 seconds because everyone's pressing their cooldowns. So there are just like so many downsides to breath, and way too much power is baked into breath. If breath wasn't so long of a cooldown, or if it wasn't such a if you actually did damage outside of breath, it would be okay. But that's never the situation with breath.
Yeah.
All right, we get down to our C tier now. On our over on the Wowhead page, we have this defined as specs that would be surprising to see a copy of in broader dungeon compositions. They have multiple of either survivability, utility, or damage holding them back, making them difficult to excel with at a higher level. And yet, our first C tier spec is Fire Mage, which has been one of the most common good specs in the history of M+. What's changed here going into Dragonflight?
Dude, that Ignite nerf. Okay, so they got I think 2 Ignite nerfs in a row. So first off, Fire Mage was only really niche at like higher levels of keys anyways, because you needed trash packs to live long enough for them to be able to really get their Ignite built up and do a lot of damage. And then they nerfed it, and then they were like, all right, that was not enough. And then they nerfed it again, and you're like, okay, so it went from being only really good at higher level keys, where trash lives a long time, to being bad at high keys, because even with trash living a long enough time. I think the biggest deal with them being in C tier is almost exclusively damage tuning based. I think that their utility is like fairly okay, all things considered. You've played with Fire Mage before, you know what they bring utility wise. Their survivability is just as good as any other mage spec, but I think that their damage is catastrophically low, and they need to be played around to do catastrophically low damage.
Yeah, I am curious how Fire Mage performs now in hard keys, as you've said, because like maybe we're underestimating it a little bit. Like, yeah, it's not gonna be great, but maybe it's like possibly B tier. That's sort of how I feel about
maybe it's
Fire
doing
Mage, but...
maybe it's doing 60k DPS overall, with the best spec is doing 90.
yeah. I mean, like, it's not amazing, but it can't be that bad, right? But I do agree that like it suffers really hard from either things dying too fast, or just like, you know, not having good combust values in general. It's sort of like Frosty K except less scuffed.
Yeah,
but it's also just like really weak at the moment, so I can't really say.
So Pure's also running the issue where it's like, it seems like it's the third best mage spec. So first off, you start to running into an issue where you don't see them that often, so you don't really understand how good they are, and so they see less play, and then they're like, oh, deemed this bad. There was always an issue with Pure's, is like, okay, they're going to get placed lower if you were the third best spec of whatever class. Yeah,
it is very true. They are the weakest mage easily.
Yeah.
All right, up next, the Balanced Druid, down in the C tier. Tettles is our resident Moonkin. Why do they got to buff you guys this time?
I mean, the utility is still some of the best in the game. I think that it would be ridiculous to say that anything other than utility wise, Moonkin is one of the best specs just for DPS. The damage is like really bad. The damage is really bad, and the way it does damage is not great. So you have like really high long ramp time, similar to Fire Mage. So it takes you a while to get your damage going, somewhere in the order of like 15 seconds before you really start to do damage, and you want pulls to be lasting upwards of 45 seconds minimum, which is like, okay, if you're having pulls last over 45 seconds pretty consistently, you are doing a world first level of key, which is not like something that you're going to see all too often. On top of that, their damage, once it does get rolling, not good. Their survivability, people have this notion that their survivability is like super sick. It's pretty average. They didn't gain anything realistically. It's probably like bottom half survivability, but there's a lot of specs that have ridiculous survivability now. So it's one of those situations where it's like, it's okay. If its survivability was its weakest trait, it probably would be a lot higher.
One thing I would say about Boomkin is I sort of feel like it suffers from the same thing as Fire Mage.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's not going to perform well like 90% of the time, but I do feel like if we do ever see Boomkin in high keys, I do feel like it belongs higher than the C. C definitely feels a little bit low for Boomkins, but yeah, I guess like on average it's probably closer to a C.
Their damage,
possibly even a D.
Their damage is like, if you're basing it purely off damage, it's not good. But
I mean I've definitely seen, because like I was playing with Goop a bit, playing Boomkin, and he's definitely been performing really well on it. But that's also if we're doing like higher keys and we're actually playing around in Karn.
If you're doing high keys of a very specific dungeon, you're playing around it. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe it's not like that bad.
Yeah, I mean, it could still pop off at times, but it's definitely...
I agree.
Definitely not always.
All right, up next we have Destruction Warlock, the How the Mighty Have Fallen from Havoc tier last season down to C here. Obviously, they lost their set bonus. What else has changed to bring Destro into the dumpster?
I talked to Cal Mozzie a decent bit about this. So there was like previously you play like a Reign of Chaos build, and so now you end up having to play like a more Chaos Bolt right side oriented build for Destro Lock. Their single target damage is not bad. It's actually kind of similar to the amount of single target damage that like Demonology is going to output, but their AoE is where they start to fall behind pretty considerably. And then it's like a situation where I think it's just going to be the third best Warlock spec, so it ends up in C tier, kind of like that. Their mass AoE is not great anymore.
Yeah, this class sucks. I've seen it in action. I've seen Cryptics try it. Shella try it. It is definitely not a good spec at the moment.
I think there's a world where
Warlock.
I think there's a world where you could justify putting it in B because it's a Warlock and its survivability is just so stupid. Again, third best Warlock spec damage seems like very lackluster. Okay, it probably deserves to be in C.
Yeah, I think it's like similar to the Mage situation where you already have Afflock and Demo up there, so
yeah.
Destro belongs down there.
Where they have like really tangible reasons that they would be brought to very specific things.
Agreed.
All right. Closing out our C tier, we have the Arms Warrior, another spec. I don't know, has Cryptics been trying this one as well in keys at all?
I mean, I've seen him play Fury, but I haven't seen anyone play Arms at all. I have no idea what Arms is like.
Yeah, so a problem with this spec as well is that when you play AoE talents, you lose quite a bit of single target, is my understanding of Arms and Dragonflight.
So there's like a Bladestorm build or a Juggernaut Execute build, and it's like having to pick between the two of those is not like it does Arms basically no favors. In addition to that, there's survivability. We talked about how good Fury Warrior survivability was, but Arms has to give up basically like 4 points in the class tree that Fury didn't, so they actually lose a decent amount of survivability. Now they did just get buffed a little bit. So they may, again, we talked about this for all the C tier specs. Could they be slightly higher than this? Yes. I don't expect their damage to be like that good. And their single target damage in M+, especially outside of Execute, is bad. Like really, really bad.
Holy bad.
It's not Marksmanship Hunter, but it's not good.
Whoa, spoilers! All right, yeah, closing out our tier list, we do have the remaining 2 Hunter specs down in D tier, both Survival and MM.
God damn.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the weaknesses of the Hunter class in general. Survival actually has a little bit of extra like self-sustain, right, compared to the other Hunter specs, but still we're talking about an extremely fragile class and then 2 specs that don't appear to do insane amounts of damage to potentially justify it, right?
So Survival Hunter is decent single target, bad AoE, and it's a Hunter. So it's got really bad survivability. These are not qualities you want to have like in a DPS for M+. You don't want one of the big notes to be bad AoE. Wildfire Bomb just doesn't do that much damage anymore. And realistically, they have the Hunter issue where they have 4 medium bad defensives, where it's like, okay, yeah, you have a decent amount of buttons, but like none of them really do anything. Marksmanship's big deal is like their AoE is slightly better, but they have like the worst single target in the game. They got a 10% aura buff. I think they could use 15% more.
Yeah, it's quite bad from what I've heard about the single target. So I agree. That's something that we're fingers crossed for a buff on. Dorki, do you have I guess we already talked a little bit about how you think Hunter is the worst class in the game. Any additional thoughts on MM or Serve?
No idea.
Okay.
Their utility, none. They have none.
Yeah, the binding was a huge thing for Hunters and now non-existent. Of course, you're still looking at specs that have, Trank Shot, a couple other little things here or there that they can bring utility-wise, but tremendous pain for Hunters worldwide. Anyways, that is our M+ DPS tier list. Let us know in the comments what you think about it. This is also, we are going to keep this updated over on Wowhead. This is the Wowhead M+ DPS tier list, which we'll be coming in and changing as we either learn how dumb and wrong we were about some of these things, and also balance changes come in and change these things as well, which hopefully there are at least some forthcoming.
I do think that like most things are within like one tier pretty consistently. We do have like a lot of knowledge, assuming that things don't change in a massive way with class tuning, which it might.
Yeah, we'll have to see. Thanks again for joining us for this one, Dorki. Much appreciated for your insight. We'll catch you guys in the next one.
One more thing before we go. I do want to say, I do feel like these specs are a little bit closer than we make it out to be, but we do have to make these distinctions. That way we're not just cramming everything into A tier. But yep, that is all.